working?
Yeah, that's how I sync the audio later. I clap.
Cool.
And I sync it with the clap.
All right.
Very professional. Okay, so let's see. How do you what's your main source of finding what you consider true knowledge?
Okay. I guess to expand on that idea a little bit, could we try, in what way is knowledge true? Just because the term seems a little vague initially. So can you just expand on that idea a little bit more?
Or do you like the formulation of in what way is knowledge true?
Yeah, and just are we taking that in a more personal sense? Yeah.
Well, it can be personal, or it can be more methodological, I guess.
Okay.
Depends on your perspective, really.
Okay. So then, from that perspective, I guess a lot of it is more partially religious as well as mixed in just faith and science in a way, where I think that they don't really contradict each other, but you kind of need faith to believe in science for the most part.
You need to have faith in the methodology of science?
Yeah, exactly. Where, in my experience, science isn't as absolute as a lot of people make it out to be, and there's a lot of gray area that isn't usually acknowledged, and that's where faith comes in, because we're going off of consistent patterns, repeated methods, and just constant variables that lead to one or possibly multiple answers.
Okay, fair enough. So for you, a sort of religious grounding and science have to work together.
Yes.
In a certain sense. So do you approach your religious worldview differently than you approach your science?
I would say so.
So in kind of flesh that out for me, how because you can't, do you approach religion with a sort of reductionist scientific mindset, sort of testing it as a proposition via experience or otherwise, or do you approach it differently somehow?
I would argue that I used to do one of the reductionist sort of view to Christianity, or in my faith it's Christianity, where I needed to see the proof, I needed to have a solid, firm, logical basis in order to believe it, but over time it's become more of this is the principle and idea that I have grown up with, but I rejected initially, and I've come back to because I find meaning and value in some of the teachings that I read through religious text.
Okay, so there's a sort of meaning and value to the religious text. Mm-hmm. In what way, if it's not a sort of scientific way, does the religious claim correspond with the observable reality around you? How do they correspond if they don't correspond in a sort of scientific way?
I feel like it corresponds a lot in sort of a sense of comfort.
Okay.
Where when it comes to religion and faith, it assures me that I am not meant to know all the answers. Okay. That everything isn't known to me because there is some, and I'll just use this, a hypothetical, higher being that has more understanding of the world around me.
Yeah.
And to me, it's just I'm not going to endlessly seek answers that aren't there or that I can't understand, so I can at least find some comfort knowing that I won't know everything.
So it creates a firm border in which the veil of mystery can be pointed at correctly.
Yes.
Something like that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the veil of mystery, obviously, after you get over that border by your own understanding, you can't understand it, and no one but God can in some sense.
Yeah.
But how does the stuff before that border, if you'll allow me the terminology, correspond with your religious principles? Or is it sort of I don't want to use the term arbitrary, but I'm trying to flesh out this question. How do you do you see, let's put it like this, do you see patterns that are tangible and not, let's say, in the realm of mystery, mm-hmm. that point to that mystery existing in the way that you see it? Like, do you see patterns that are more tangible, that point to that reality in some sense?
Yes, if I'm understanding correctly, it's more. So I'm studying geology here.
Yeah.
And a lot of earth science is incredibly difficult to understand just because the scope of interactions that we see in the world around us are incredibly complex. And there are a lot of recognized patterns where we have, like, chemical compositions is a very consistent pattern that we can identify regularly, but there aren't always consistent patterns between everything. There's a few that we know that we see, like 99% repetition, but there's always an exception that can occur because nature isn't always perfect.
So there's a sort of border or middle ground between human categories that demonstrates a sort of underlying chaos?
Yeah.
Okay, and in what way does that correspond to the religious ideas you subscribe to?
Could you rephrase?
So, this kind of chaos between human categories, in what way does that pattern point to the sort of macro religious structure that you subscribe to? Is that clear? Or is that confusing?
I think I understand where a lot of it is just,
Yeah.
I just find myself going back to my previous statement where it was, I find a lot of,
Yeah.
like, I'll use your terminology, like the human border to be incredibly restrictive, and in my eyes, humans are always limited by our physical and mental capabilities because we aren't infinite. We aren't
Yeah.
omnipresent, omnipotent, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And when it comes to like the last 1% of like a margin of error where multiple things can occur, I think that just goes back into more of my faith where at this point, we really cannot explain fully. And to an extent, just because we don't have an answer doesn't mean it's not out there.
Okay. So I would like to try to embody an oppositional perspective.
Okay.
Just to see how to make heads or tails of these things. Because I can imagine some of the agnostics that I might have talked to, or even atheists for that matter, would say something like, okay, well, that's just the God of the gaps.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's just, you have a gap of mystery, and you use that by itself to point to a sort of transcendent entity.
Mm-hmm.
When they would say, okay, well, just give us enough time, and we'll use our science, we'll use our reason, and we'll figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
How would you respond to that sort of argument?
I would say that's a perfectly reasonable response.
Okay.
Like,
then why aren't you an atheist?
well, because I find a meaning and purpose through faith, where I used to call myself an atheist and an agnostic in the past, and from that, I would spiral down a sort of meaning black hole.
Yeah, sure.
And in that, when it comes to like more faith and whatnot, I find like both the comfort and purpose to keep moving forward, where there was like like with agnosticism or atheism, where a lot of this is more random chance.
Okay.
I do like the mindset where there was intent behind like the world around us, because though it is possible that this all could be random chance, I do like to think that viewing it through the eyes of the world is beautiful. It was designed to be that way, to be, I guess, comforting to me.
Okay.
It helps me push forward and try to learn more.
Okay, fair enough. So I suppose your answer to that question is that, yeah, you've been down that kind of road before, and you found this kind of meaningless trench.
In a sense.
Yeah. So in that case, why is it important to read the Bible? Like, what does it give you? Does it give you some form of knowledge that corresponds with reality in some way or another, or is it just reading it because it's I don't know, it gives you a good feeling?
I'm reading it more because it reminds me that I'm not perfect.
Okay.
And it reminds me that it takes a lot of hard work and forgiveness and love in order to really push forward and admit that, hey, I have flaws and I fall to some of my vices every once in a while, but that doesn't mean that I'm a bad person, because in the Christian belief, God allows for repentance and forgiveness.
Yeah.
And I really aspire to that idea and try to push that idea forward, where though like diversity of ideas and opinions is beautiful, that ultimately people can change for the better. And I like to subscribe to that ideal and hope. I think I lost my point a little at the end there, but just circling back to just restate, I believe it just allows me to self-reflect and just try to adjust and change myself as a person.
Okay, yeah, so it allows for a sort of repentance that gives you the means to get better.
Yes.
And you're pointing towards a sort of ideal that you can, that's what better means in that sort of context. Okay, sure. So I would articulate maybe a Christian perspective now that I'm wondering if you find resonance with. So, certain people might see the biblical text, the scriptures, as a sort of pattern. Not all of it, there's a sort of, cascade of things that might be more tangible, I suppose, more like, brushing your teeth in the morning, but there's some things that are more abstract and more condensed that tell a story about the patterns that make reality up, that constitute reality. Hopefully I'm not being too obscure, but something like with regard to our previous conversation, how there's this chaos that exists between human categories, they would say that corresponds to something like the tohu vabohu. You know what I mean?
I am not familiar with
That's the Hebrew
it.
for the deep sea in the early Genesis story.
Okay.
To say there's this underlying chaos in which order is kind of drawn out of. And so stories like Genesis, stories like even Exodus that might have a more tangible aspect to them, and even obviously the story of Christ, would build a pattern that demonstrates the, more philosophical, metaphysical truths of reality that aren't necessarily scientific, but still correspond with reality in that sense, rather than like a sort of, like a sense you could put under a microscope. I don't know. And I might have, that might be a little confusing. There's pieces of that might be a little bit underexplained, but just generally, how would you respond to a perspective like that? That takes the Bible to have these philosophical patterns that correspond with reality in a sort of metaphysical sense.
Are you also saying it's like, how would I respond to someone who takes biblical teachings or just religious teachings a bit more literally?
Literally in a certain sense. Literally in the sense of, Genesis is describing the structure of reality. Not literal in the sense of 2,000 years or 3,000 years ago there was a guy named Adam and a woman named Eve that actually ate an apple.
Okay.
But literally in the sense of describing in a sort of analogical sense how reality works. For example, the chaos underneath things that God draws the world out from.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think. I don't think I have a response for something like that.
Yeah.
Because in some sense...
It's really, sorry, I want to, maybe this would help you understand. It's really the distinction between seeing the Bible as a set of propositions that you should believe, and more seeing the Bible as a kind of analogical description of the way reality works.
Okay. So my response to that would probably be humans are flawed, and ultimately through like passing of knowledge, I do not believe, this is my own personal sense, and I'm pretty sure I would get a lot of flack for this, but I don't think a Bible or most religious texts are a be-all end-all, where a lot of it is human interpretation, a lot of it is it has human involvement, and like playing a game of telephone over thousands of years, some ideas are going to be changed because that's just like cultures change, rules change, societies change, and language over time evolves, where you have like different meanings of like Jewish words, where if we take them literally, they mean something way worse than what the word meant all the way back when.
Okay, so how do we maintain knowledge of, let's say, what's up and what's down? If words and language is constantly shifting with the tides of time and culture, how do we know even how to interpret the text, or if we should even keep it around?
That is a very good question, and I think a lot of that has to do through, I guess, just communication and just a general cultural baseline of agreement, which, I mean, through time, you could make an argument that there has been a consistent cultural guideline that is just changed as time has gone on.
Okay, describe this cultural guideline? What do you
mean? It's like where, I guess I might be losing some of the point where it's just like it's generally accepted that leaves are green or the sky is blue.
Okay, sure.
Where those are more just like constant observations where like laws, I would argue differently because those change through every single culture.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's a sort of cultural agreement, and I guess how does that relate to something like a sacred text, like in your estimation? Like how does the leaves are green, sky is blue kind of word correspondence with a sort of phenomenological reality, I guess? Mm-hmm. Like, how does that relate to something like a sacred text, like the Bible, and how we interpret that?
That's a good question, and I don't have the answer, which is why I guess with just what we've talked about, a lot of it has to go back on faith and trust, for the most part, where when it comes to the Bible, though there are multiple different versions of it, like you have the King James as like the most prominent version, other like iterations and translations, a lot of it is just trust and belief that what we are reading and what we see today is consistent with what we saw back then.
Yeah, so we have a certain faith that, let's almost say that the human psyche operated similarly back then as it does now, and there's a consistency of phenomenological experience that allows us to have some degree of relationship to the texts that were written back then, because we both see the world in a similar sense. Mm-hmm. Is that a good articulation?
Kind of. I guess what I'm really struggling with is I don't have a lot of background experience with a lot of this, so it's difficult for me to really say my own beliefs on the matter.
Yeah.
And if I knew a little bit more about just like translation and record keeping and history of how the Bible was written and what we see today, then I could have a bit more of a better response, because I just don't know.
Okay, well that in itself is a sort of methodological claim to say that if we use like historicity and biblical manuscripts to try to track back and even like translate the languages in a way that makes cultural sense, then we can have a better understanding of what the text says.
Yeah,
that's fine. I think that's a very Christian answer. I would say it. And what would you say to someone, let's say a Catholic or an Orthodox Christian, that wants to use the authority of this higher church in order to make the claim about biblical interpretation? Like, oh, well, the Pope says this, or the bishops say that, stuff like that.
This is probably one of my more controversial opinions, where I strongly disagree with the idolization within like certain figures of like Catholicism, where I guess in this case, since you brought up the Pope, the history of the Pope like being the voice and word of God, I feel like is led to a lot of the major corruption that we see with Christianity today. Because the Pope is a person, and people make mistakes, people have their own vices, they have motivations, essentially.
Okay, sure.
And
so, go ahead.
That's pretty much where it just leads. It takes away from the true meaning and intent of the religious text because there's human influence muttering it.
Okay, yeah. So, in that case, let's just do a little thought experiment. Sorry, I don't have too many viewers, but sorry, if anybody's Catholic watching this, let's throw Catholicism out, just to the side. Is there a correct way to structure a church in order to maintain the consistency of the text that helps maximize the meaning that you derive from it? Is there a way to structure a church service, a church organizationally, that is most effective for that, let's say, the maximizing of meaning? Because it seems like that's a very important facet.
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of it has to be more... I don't really have much of an answer on that.
Okay.
Because in my eyes, a church, I mean, even in like the Bible or some of the original writings of it, a church has never been a place. It's always been a people, and over time it's become a place.
Okay.
Where I guess structure of a church just has to be a lot on the individual, because it's, I don't know, I'm very loosely saying stuff because I would call myself a milquetoast Christian.
Oh, that's an interesting thing to self-identify with.
Yeah, I'm not a super well-practiced Christian.
Oh, shoot. This might be a microphone. Well, we might have to call it, actually, because I don't want to break...
Oh, with the rain?
Yeah, the rain. I don't have enough money for a microphone. So.
Yeah, that's very fair.
I guess one last question that comes to mind is, like, so you said it's always kind of been a place, not a people. Sorry, a people, not a place, except for maybe recently. Wasn't it kind of a place like when the Logos, let's say, was implicitly existent in the ancient Judaism? Mm-hmm. Like, was it because they had like the temple and everything? But would you say like the New Covenant sort of changed that relationship?
Yeah, and I would definitely say that where Jesus' teachings will really flip that on the head, where I might be getting the word wrong, but there was like the tabernacle originally, or there was this like tent that they would carry around with them where they would go for a place of worship.
Okay.
And nowadays with like Jesus and the New Testament, it's more about your relationship with God.
But if it's dissipated all over the place, someone might say, okay, well now it's, instead of one pope, it's like a million popes. And like what's stopping like all these different people from having vastly different beliefs and different interpretations of the text and creating a sort of degeneration? Like, what's stopping that from happening?
I don't think anything stopped that from happening.
So is that a negative thing, or do we just kind of have to trust that it'll work out?
I don't know. And because I don't know, I guess it just goes back to trust.
Okay. Yeah, and that's why I kind of left that option there, because I figured that might be a good route. Well, shoot, it was good talking to you, Colton.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, for sure.